Community stand a chance. How could he warn everyone? Mark made himself slow down and think. The quickest way to warn everyone was to get to the command post. To do that, he had to get past the 4 MZBs walking in front of him. He laid his carbine down on the street as quietly as he could. Fortunately, the gunfire from both the crew he'd just left and the gate guards masked the metallic click of blue metal on asphalt. He drew his Colt and ran on his toes as quickly and quietly as he could. He had 9 shots in the pistol, 2 rounds for each intruder with an extra just in case. He'd done this drill at an IDPA pistol match. You started on one side and fired 1 round into each perp. Then you came back the other way and bestowed another hollow point to each of the targets. He had to get within 5 yards of the intruders to ensure solid hits in the dark. He was still over 25 yards away. As he ran toward them, his mind absorbed everything about them that it could. They were all different sizes. Their clothing ran the gamut from camouflage BDUs to designer jeans. They all carried their weapons differently. 20 yards now. None of their weapons matched. One was carrying a Mini-14, one some kind of short-barreled shotgun. Another appeared to be an old Winchester lever-action rifle, and the last an AR-15. He was within 15 yards now. His toes were cramping from running on them. He noticed their shoes. 2 had boots, 1 tennis shoes, and one, the shortest one, the one with the Winchester, had on sandals, women's sandals. He stopped dead in his tracks. He couldn't shoot a woman in the back, but he had to. If he didn't, she or one of the others might kill one of his friends. Maybe he could shoot the men, and she would give up. Or maybe she would turn and put a bullet hole in him with that old cowboy gun. No, he had to stick with his plan. When she crossed the fence with hostile intentions, she became an MVB, not a woman. He started running toward them again. The space has opened back up to about 30 yards. Focus on the problem, he told himself. He would start on the right and work to the left, right between the shoulder blades. It was horrible to think about shooting someone in the back, but he had no choice. He had to warn the rest of the subdivision, and this was the only way he could get to the... Mark realized that all of the shooting had stopped. What had happened? The MZBs must have realized it at the same time. They froze in place for a second. Then they began to look at each other. Mark became aware that his feet had stopped moving. He was still over 20 yards from the invaders. Could he get them from here? He raised his Colt to determine if he could see the sights. The biggest of the MZBs must have seen him move from a corner of his eye. He wheeled around to face Mark, and the other 3 whirled in unison as if they were playing Simon Says. Mark's mind went blank. What was he to do now? He couldn't see his sights well enough to ensure a hit at this distance, and even if he could, he would get 1 or maybe 2 of the MZBs before they shredded him with their long guns. Maybe they didn't know that. Even if they did, maybe none of them would want to be the one who didn't make it. Mark had never been much of a poker player, but he prayed he could bluff his way through this one. He almost didn't believe he was doing this. The voice came out of his throat, seemed as if it were coming from somewhere else. The first one to move dies. He hoped it was dark enough that the MZBs couldn't see his hands shaking. Lay your weapons on the ground in front of you and step back 5 steps. The intruders just stared at him. They seemed not even to be breathing. Mark saw the woman look at the man beside her, the one with the shotgun. So he was the leader. Mark barked out the order again. Put your weapons on the ground now. You have 5 seconds or I'll have my men open up on you. Mark took a deep breath and tried to stop his hands from shaking. 1. No one was moving. 2. They stood like statues. Bob, Joe, the one with the shotgun gets it first. He was running out of chips to bluff with. He wanted to look around to see if there was any cover if this didn't work, but he knew that would give him away. 3. The woman started to lay her rifle on the ground, but the leader reached out and placed a hand on her arm to stop her. He hollered back at Mark, Mister, you've got no one else out there. Otherwise, we'd have heard or seen them. You lay down your pistol and maybe you'll live through this. You can believe that if you want, but you didn't see or hear me until I wanted you to. There are 5 men armed surrounding you. You can't see them, but if you want to bet your life they aren't there, just move that shotgun an inch. I promise it will be the last thing you ever do. 4. You're lying, the man called back. Tell your guys to show themselves. Mark thought he'd heard that voice before, but his mind turned to other things. His bluff was not working. When he said 5, they would know for sure he was lying. Was this it for him? It had only been yesterday that he had talked to Jim about taking care of his family if something happened. Had his subconscious been aware of something? How would Jess and the kids do without him? What kind of man would his son become? How many grandkids would he have? So many questions, and he might not ever know the answers. Well, he would do everything he could to stick around for them. The odds were stacked heavily against him, but he didn't give up. He wouldn't give up. If he could just get some kind of edge, nothing huge, just enough to help him a little. A plan appeared in his head. When I count the next number, you'll all be dead, but I've buried enough people in the last few weeks to last me a lifetime. That part at least was true. I'm going to have my men step out so you can see them. Be very careful not to make any threatening moves, or they'll shoot first and ask questions later. He couldn't believe he just used such a corny cliche, but it was too late to worry about it now. When the MZBs turned to look, he would open fire and move back and to his left. Maybe he'd get lucky. He called out loudly, "Okay, Joe, you and your men step out so these folks can see you." Mark was praying with everything he had in him. He watched the leader. As soon as his head turned, Mark would try to kill him first. He strained his eyes, trying to see his front sight. Movement behind the MZBs broke his concentration. 4 ghosts appeared from behind some bushes in one of the yards. Had God heard his prayer and sent some deceased old veterans back to help him? They looked like they'd come from the beaches of Normandy. 4 of the countless souls who had perished more than half a century ago. The apparitions moved with difficulty through the atmosphere, as a human would when walking through water. They had a mechanical gait, as if they were older than time itself. Mark blinked twice to make sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Perhaps he just wanted to see something. Perhaps he was already dead and didn't know it, and the ghosts had come to show him to his final judgment. If I was you, I'd do like the karate man said and lay my weapons on the ground. Mark felt tears rolling down his cheeks. Gunny's voice was the sweetest sound he had ever heard. The sound of salvation. 4 MZB guns clattered to the ground with a sound that assured Mark he was still alive. Gunny, George, Abby, and Alice moved up, and each one covered an MZB. Mark advanced and gathered the dropped weapons. The leader, who Mark now recognized as one of the refugees who had been given some water a couple days ago, looked at him. "You said you had 5 men." "I lied," he flatly told the man. Then he turned to Gunny. "There might be other groups besides these 2, Gunny." "Don't think so." Gunny showed Mark one of the FRS radios that Manny's grandson had given him. "Jim radioed a minute ago and said that the guys they captured told him there was only one other group, and you got them. But I got Rover 1 going around the perimeter just in case." "You mean we got them?" Mark smiled. Gunny ordered the MZBs to walk to the command post with their hands on top of their heads. Mark fell in behind his 4 saviors and carried the captured weapons. He walked to within earshot of Gunny. "How did you know I needed help?" "We didn't," the old Marine replied. "When we heard the shooting, me and George got up and grabbed our rifles. The girls insisted on coming with us, and I didn't have time to argue with them. We was walking down to the command post when we saw these 4 coming up the street. We hid in the bushes and was going to ambush them when they got closer. We never saw you till you started hollering. Why were you following them?" "I had to get to the command post to warn everyone there might be more MZBs. They were in the way, and the only thing I could do was to take them out. The only thing I could think to do was to take them out." "Where's your rifle?" "It's jammed. All I had was my pistol." Gunny slowly nodded his head as he absorbed what had happened. "Takes some mighty big ones to face down 4 bad guys by yourself," he said. When they got to the command post, Mark got some zip ties and bound the hands of the 4 intruders. The guard in the tower who had dropped the flashlight hadn't been hit, but he'd reported that the tin roof now had a nice hole that needed to be patched. Mark looked down the center of the road and saw Jim and the other guys marching their prisoners up. Peter reported that the sheriff was on his way. He told Mark that the 2 attackers in the front had crossed the road and entered the ditch on this side of the road. When they did, Abe Evans and the OP shot one of them, and the other had surrendered immediately. One of the gate guards was bringing him up. The one Abe shot was dead. When Jim arrived with his charges, one of them had been wounded in the shoulder. Jim sent Ralph up to get Lisa so she could look at the wounded man. Mark zip-tied the others, 2 men and 2 women, and sat them with his 4. Jim also recognized the man who appeared to be the leader of this attack. He was the man who had argued with Jim and the gate guards. It appeared that he and his small crew had set up camp just down the road and had recruited some other passers-by to help them attack. They had also scouted the neighborhood as best they could to try to find the best way in. When asked about what they intended to do if they gained control, the attackers didn't seem to have thought that out completely. When Greg Gentry marched the last living attacker up to the command post, he was promptly restrained with the makeshift cuffs and put with his companions. After that, it seemed like only a few minutes before Kurt arrived.